Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maurice Bric. I'm attached to the History Department in the Clinton Institute in UCD, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here this evening. And I know Noel Whelan's name has been mentioned already, and will be, I'm sure, quite a number of times over the weekend. But as Noel was my former student, I'd like also to remember him in his own town. He was certainly a very stimulating, never boring, generous, personable student. And I really just can't believe that when I return to Dublin next week that he will not be there to chat to and to talk to and to analyse and to enlighten me about all aspects of modern Irish society. So again, as I said, I remember him in a very special way. I've known him for a long time. Very Eshtaker of a So two things. I'll first of all introduce each of our four speakers. I will then ask them to confine their observations to about 8 or 10 minutes or so. Hopefully we'll have some time for some interaction between the speakers, and finally involve you in some questions, all within 1 hour. But I can guarantee you that we will stick to the timetable, because as you know, we have an interview with Seamus Mallon scheduled for St. Michael's at 7:30, so I want to stick to the timetable. I will introduce the speakers in the order in which they will present. Our first speaker is Ian Dalton. Ian Dalton has been a senior civil servant, particularly in the Department of Finance, but he has also had another life. Even when I first got to know him as an undergraduate in UCC a long time ago, he's always had this continuing interest in history, research in Irish history, and publishes and has published and continues to publish a great deal on Irish history, most particularly on the history of the Church of Ireland. He's also the co-editor with one of our other speakers, Ida Milne, of this absolutely fantastic series of essays called Protestant and Irish, the Minority Search for Place in Independent Ireland, which was published by Cork University Press earlier this year, and which I'm told today is going into paperback. So it's a red letter day for Ian and for Ida. Our second speaker is Deirdre Nuttall. Deirdre is from the Greater New Ross area, and she studied folklore and archaeology in UCD. After that went on to Durham University, and as I understand it, has been engaged a lot in developing an oral history narrative and to try and get a new sense, a fresh sense of the traditions and narratives of the Protestant minority. Our third speaker is Felix Larkin. I could say see above, because he's already been introduced, but just let me add my own sentence or two to what Eileen has said, what the County Librarian has said. Again, I've known Felix for a long time. Again, like Ian, he has spent a lot of his professional life in the public service, but he's also been a distinguished contributor to debates on Irish history over the years, and in particular to the history of Irish cartoons and caricatures, which gives a very interesting perspective into the way in which historians who rely on more traditional sources have interpreted the past. So I'm very glad to welcome him. And finally, our final speaker will be Ida Milne, who, as I said, is the co-editor of this volume of essays, Protestantism in the Republic, and she is a teacher in Carlow College, lectures in European history in Carlow College, has a particular interest in the social history of disease, and in that regard has published a very fine book on the flu epidemic of 1918-1919, which was published recently by the University of Manchester Press. So those are the introductions.
Okay, it's lovely to see so many happy faces. Happy? Possibly. Anyway, I was born in 1950. That was the Holy Year, the year of the Mother and Child scheme, the year that the Angelus Bell was first transmitted on Radio Éireann, the year of the proclamation of the dogma of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary into heaven, the year of the Tilson case involving the religious upbringing of children born of a mixed marriage, the year that the leader of the right-wing ultra-Catholic organisation, Maria Duce, declared that, quote, all non-Catholic sects are false and evil. Not, it seemed, a good year to be born a Protestant, or Irish, or even recognised as such. Yet, Here I just about still am, and here still is the community into which I was born. Smaller, yes, than that day in December 1921, when the treaty kicked the ankles out from under their political and cultural footing, but with perhaps the recognition of a slow burn of influence, as Southern society is desectarianised, secularised, and found itself, perhaps to its own surprise, able to agree broadly with Roy Foster's response to the hoary old question, why did the Reformation not succeed in Ireland? And his response was, it did, but it took 450 years. 1950 perhaps marked the high point of the truly triumphalist Roman Catholic state. After that, things slowly began to change, so that by the 1960s, in modernising Ireland, central heating was a more interesting topic of conversation than sectarianism. Vatican II and the music of the Beatles and the Beach Boys ensured that things would not be the same again. We found that comely maidens could also be come hither ones. With the following wind of increasing secularism and decreasing sectarianism, Tone's notion of a common Irish citizenship transcending religious and denominational differences began to take off in the 1960s, but were not yet truly airborne. How Southern Protestants saw their native soil, their own communities and others in the formative half-century after independence is the subject of our recent book of essays. It's provoked conversations, which it was designed to do. These are sometimes uncomfortable, but they are necessary if we're to see ourselves as others see us. And I hope we can continue in that spirit of inquiry this evening. Narrow national narratives are the enemy of understanding, tolerance, openness, and indeed the future. So, here, just to set the scene, are a very few quotes for you to think about from the conversations that took place in that period between Southern Protestants. They might assist in understanding of this complex, often conflicted community and how it came to terms with a new Ireland spinning itself as an old Catholic and Gaelic one. Here's the Reverend Dudley Fletcher in May 1922, quote, I am proud of my British blood and name. I allow the same privilege to my Gaelic neighbour. We both want to be proud of Irishmen. The Church of Ireland Primate, Charles Darcy in early 1923, quote, we must prove that it is part of our creed to give loyal support to the ruling powers of the governments which are lawfully established. J.M. Hone in 1932, no cautious leader of Irish Protestant opinion desires to see the growth of a political anti-clericalism in Southern Ireland. It would work out to the political and social disadvantage of members of the minority churches. Archbishop Gregg in Dublin in the same year, quote, the Church of Ireland is the most Irish thing there is in Ireland today. The Dean of Ross, 1932, on the contribution of the Church to Irish life, her sons and daughters have taken part in everything that concerns the welfare of the country, and their only wish has been that a larger share should come into their hands. The Irish Times, in February 1936, on many points of policy we agree, more or less cordially, with Mr. De Valera. The Bishop of Limerick in 1944, on Southern Protestants' aims and objectives, to set our own house in order, to live hopefully in it in neighbourly fashion, to express a method of living valuable to the state. And the Irish Times in 1945 asked its Protestant readers to be, quote, unconditionally loyal to the new republic. The Church of Ireland Gazette on the mother and child scheme, 1950, quote, communist interference in the family. Mr. Justice Black in the Supreme Court in the Tilson case in 1951, ever since this constitution was enacted, I was firmly convinced, as I am still, that in respect of all legal rights and privileges, it admitted of no discrimination as between persons of different religions. If I had thought it did, I never could have made a public declaration that I could uphold it. Dean Victor Griffin on contrarian essayist Hubert Butler. God, he'd get us into trouble. Hubert Butler on the Church of Ireland, quote, a poor old phoenix, moulting and blind and bedraggled, gazing mesmerised into the fire, but unable to summon up the courage to take the last leap. I still think it has the power to lay a very fine egg. So do I.
Hello everyone, I went to school in St. Joseph's, so I used to come here all the time after school. It's funny to stand here now. I'm just going to talk about the project I've been involved in, which has been looking at Protestants not as a denomination, but as a folk group or a cultural group. Protestants in independent Ireland haven't really been explored as a folk or cultural group rather than from socioeconomic and historical perspectives. And for many years, pre- and post-independence, folklorists, anthropologists and others did not consider them to be a folk culture. If we look at early scholars of Irish folklore and culture, most of them were actually Protestants and most of them were quite well-to-do. For them, exploring traditional culture in Ireland was a way of expressing a sense of national pride without having to challenge uncomfortable assumptions, or without having to uncomfortably challenge assumptions about the social order that they had been born into. So you look at people like Lady Wilde and later W.B. Yeats, both of whom were firmly embedded in Irish society. They studied traditional culture and felt and said, by and large, that they were returning the traditions, their own lost past to the Catholic Irish. For a lot of these early folklorists, the attitude they had at the time, which was an attitude of the time, was that the people whose difficult lives they romanticised were basically a type of noble savage, people who kept the pure Gaelic culture alive in their lifestyles. So with this kind of early scholarship, the view of traditional Irish culture as being both primitive and Catholic contributed not only to that view among kind of cultural nationalists, but also to the view held by many Protestants that Irish Protestants therefore could not be bearers of tradition, even if in other respects their socioeconomic status was similar to their neighbours, because of their religious background. And in fact, among Protestants, there developed a self-perception as inherently rational and inherently somehow more scientific than other Irish people. By the end of the 19th century, folklore and Irish nationalism had become inextricably intertwined. Studying folklore and studying traditional culture became a political act, something that inspired people to kind of move towards the independence that we all enjoy today. And because so many people among the Protestant community at that time were quite hostile to independence, they in turn started to see folklore and traditional culture in a rather negative light. In the early 1900s, the Provost of Trinity College, then a very Protestant institution, stated that Irish folklore was, at bottom, abominable. So, pretty negative. So, most of the serious kind of academic research into this field took place after independence, and obviously by definition it therefore took place in a post-colonial environment. And as always happens, the interest was on looking at groups that had been marginalised, dismissed, and kind of understudied prior to independence. So in Ireland, obviously that meant looking at the Gaeltacht areas, looking at other marginalised communities and exploring their rich heritage as part of the nation building project. So in 1927, Seamus de Larga founded Cumann na Béile Éireann, the Irish Folklore Society. In 1930, the Irish Folklore Institute was founded to collect and study Irish folklore. And at this time, true Irish culture was seen as living in the Irish-speaking communities. Anything that suggested contact with England was seen as a contaminant from outside and as less worthy of study. This didn't just happen kind of within Irish scholarship. In the 1930s, two anthropologists came from Harvard, Arensberg and Kimball, to study the Irish. It was quite a sensitive time shortly after independence had been achieved, so De Valera arranged for them to meet all the Catholic authorities, intending for their work to show a harmonious Catholic country society, and somehow they managed to write this book without ever mentioning the recent War of Independence, or indeed the Protestant minority. In 1935, under De Valera's government, the Irish Folklore Commission was founded. They appointed full-time collectors, and bear in mind this was happening at a time of considerable poverty, so De Valera had the foresight to invest a lot of money from a fairly small pot of money into collecting aspects of traditional culture. He gave an annual grant of £3,000, which is quite a lot of money, to collect the best of what remained of Irish folklore. That same year, he had a statue of Cuchulainn placed in the GPO in honour of those who died in 1916. So De Valera's clever association of traditional culture with kind of his political party and his view of nationalism further alienated the Protestant minority and further contributed to the idea of traditional culture in Ireland as inherently Catholic. So a lot of Protestants at that time developed fairly hostile feelings towards the very idea of traditional culture, let alone the notion that they might form part of it. In 1937, a huge schools collection was done to collect traditional material using school children as collectors. Because of the kind of atmosphere that was around at the time, a lot of the people involved at kind of a grassroots level rather than at the universities interpreted it as a collection of lore from Catholic Irish people. So a very elderly gentleman from whom I collected material in the course of my current project was 9 at the time of the school's collection in 1937. He was the only Protestant child in his Catholic country school. His teacher called him up at the desk and said he was exempt from this homework. The government was not interested in families like him. At the time he was rather pleased because it was less homework for him, but it bothered him later on as he grew up, and he thought, why were they not interested in families like mine? So that was an interesting thing, and it was lovely to meet him because, as you can imagine, not so many people who participated in that project are still here. So when in the course of my project, I have interviewed 100 individuals from all over the Republic and also collected questionnaire material from hundreds more. The idea among these people, among these Protestant informants, that Irish Protestants don't take part in traditional culture is still widespread. One person said, Protestants are usually against any sort of superstition. Anything pertaining to the supernatural was very much discouraged. So, on the face of it, they're still agreeing with what people were saying in the early 1900s. However, when you ask a little bit more, you find out that statements like these, which are often made, have actually a very tenuous relationship with what people are actually doing and saying. So, interestingly, for many of the people with whom I spoke, because Protestants, as they see it, are rational by definition, therefore everything they do is rational. That includes activities intended to keep away the fairies, using prayer to heal a sick animal, or telling amusing stories about the experience of Patrick, who was, according to some, Ireland's first Presbyterian. So in the interview context, you can get some interesting kind of cognitive dissonance. For example, one informant said of her father's account of his own frightening encounter with the headless horseman on his way back from a Protestant social, I would be inclined to give it credence because, as a staunch Protestant, he was not at all superstitious. Another informant stated, we were always taught that Protestants were more rational, not superstitious. And then 2 minutes later, she told me the following. My mother not only believed in the fairies, she used to see them, and made Dad stop the car in the Wicklow Mountains so that she could get out and look. So people say one thing and they say another, and it's just an interesting contrast. So in fact, many Protestants in Ireland, particularly in rural Ireland, engaged and to some extent still engage in many of the same beliefs and customs of the Catholic majority, as well as telling many of the same stories. In some areas, there are elements of tradition that are identified as particularly Protestant. One informant reported that in her area, Catholics made May altars, but Protestants decorated May bushes. Another reported that whereas Catholics in her farming area used holy water to sprinkle on boundaries to keep away the pishogues, Protestants used salt, which she identified as a less superstitious variant of the same tradition. And there are also traditions that are particular to Protestants, include practices associated with the faith and with formal ecclesiastical practice, including the beating of the bounds, which was practiced in some parishes on Rogation Sunday, and Harvest Thanksgiving, which is obviously part of the official ecclesiastical calendar in both the Church of Ireland and Methodist churches, but also very much an active part of folk culture. And Protestants often also have an extremely rich array of folk historical narratives. These are really interesting because Protestants often tell well-known legendary historical narratives with a rather defensive tone. Many well-known legends, and people from Wexford will know at least one of them, reflect historical tensions that relate to Protestant privilege in the past, including, for example, an uncomfortably close relationship between Protestants and the devil. There are many stories about this. So when Protestants tell these same stories, as for example the story about a Catholic priest banishing the devil when the local rector has failed, they are often likely to add a gloss or a comment, and they may say something like, which must have been terribly satisfactory for all the Catholics in the area. Protestants can also be aware of common traditions that you can still hear about, such as the idea if one walks around a Protestant church 3 times, one is bound to see the devil. Protestants may relate this as an example of how folklore is used against them, which indeed it was in the 20s and 30s by devil era. And by the way, my local Protestant church, I was just recently assured that if I walked around it 3 times, I would see the devil. I have not tried yet, but maybe at Halloween we might give it a go. Protestants, when they tell stories about important historical events or periods, their stories often incorporate alternative accounts of what really happened. And as we all know, people's stories about the past are often really about what people think happened or what people wish happened rather than necessarily what actually happened. Protestants are aware to varying degrees of how their families in the years since independence have had to reinterpret their collective past to kind of hold on to a sense of cultural pride and a sense of Irishness. Prior to independence, many Irish Protestants would have been quite proud to trace descent from one of Cromwell's soldiers, for example. And actually, if you look at old copies of the Church of Ireland Gazette, you will find people saying that they are proud that they were descended from these people, and with a bit of social Darwinism thrown in, saying they feel that that blood enhanced the noble Gaelic race. Post-independence, Protestants had to learn quite quickly to find cultural pride somewhere else. And I will quote another lovely gentleman I interviewed, who said, "Let's say we were descended from Cromwell. Is that tape recorder on? Only we tend not to say it. We came over around then, not exactly then, but around that time. Only we don't tell anyone. This is anonymous, isn't it?" So, I mean, people have had to kind of reinvent their family histories, which we all do to varying extents, but in the stories that Protestants tell about the past, there is quite a lot of that, finding new things to be proud of. People tend to be proud of the Huguenot or Palatine ancestors more so. People tend to be proud of things that happened post-independence. Or another man said he talked about his Quaker ancestors, but not the rest, because Quakers did not take everyone's land and treated everyone very nicely. So, in summary, it's important when you're looking at the culture and the oral culture of any society to look not just at the majority, not just at the groups that are seen as culturally worthy or culturally important by the government, but at everyone. Because by understanding the stories that people tell from every demographic in society, you understand not just that particular group, but also all of the society a little bit better. So that's what my research is about, and any questions, I'll be here afterwards.
I'm not a Protestant, and I'm not a scholar of Irish Protestantism. Indeed, most of what I know about the history of Irish Protestantism I have learned from Ian Dalton, and I would like to pay tribute here to the wonderful seminal work that he has done in this area over so many years. The reason that I am on this panel, and indeed in this book, is that, as Maurice has pointed out, I am a historian of cartoons. Though not, I hope, a cartoon historian. There is a subtle difference. Cartoons are a valuable but underused historical source. For as Steve Bell, The Guardian's brilliant cartoonist, has observed, cartoons can say things that are perhaps less easy to say in a more straightforward journalistic context. Good journalism, like good history, has to be nuanced, reflecting the complexity of the situation or issue under consideration. A cartoon, by contrast, cuts through the verbiage with a simple truth that overrides complexity, and through humour or irony appeals to instincts within us that are visceral rather than rational. I would argue that historians cannot afford to ignore the insight of cartoonists, how and what they have chosen to examine, parody and challenge should always be of interest to historians. So the editors of this book and I agreed that it might be worthwhile to examine how Southern Irish Protestants were depicted in cartoons in Irish newspapers and magazines after independence, and that is what I have done in my chapter in the book. Satire, whether in literary form or in cartoons, is regarded as something that mainly punches up. In other words, a weapon of the powerless against dominant groups and people. The perception of Southern Irish Protestants as a powerful elite makes them an obvious target for cartoonists. From the late 1870s onwards, vivid and colourful cartoons were published as supplements by the Weekly Freeman and by United Ireland, both nationalist newspapers. When Southern Irish Protestants featured in these cartoons, and they featured a lot, it was almost invariably in the guise of rapacious landowners, guilty of abusing vulnerable tenants, and they were demonised. I have reproduced in the book a typical example from the Weekly Freeman of the 18th of December, 1886, in which the plight of an evicted family at Christmas time is juxtaposed with the good fortune of their former landlord enjoying the festive season snug inside the big house in the distance. As images such as that inevitably informed how Southern Irish Protestants were presented in cartoons in Irish newspapers and periodicals after 1922. They are almost always gentry, an elite, and so fair game for satire. Even though, as Ian is always at pains to remind us, the gentry were only a small part of the Protestant population. A good example of a cartoon from this post-independence period is Cayley in the Kildare Street Club by C.E. Kelly, published in Dublin Opinion in 1934. Its humour lies in the incongruity of what was still a bastion of Anglo-Irish gentry and the Protestant professional classes hosting an event redolent of the Irish Ireland cultural revival. We see blimpish men in formal evening dress, white tie and tails, and with monocles, whizzing round in jigs and reels with their stout ladies. The cartoon includes clever wordplay with names and titles, and the use of the Irish language alongside these names and titles adds greatly to the incongruity. This is gentle mockery, tempered by social envy. For Protestants, on the receiving end of such humour, being treated as ridiculous relics of old decency was infinitely preferable to being portrayed as a people to be feared and hated, as the landlords were in the 1880s. In this respect, this cartoon mirrors a movement in the perception of Southern Irish Protestants as no longer a threat to Irish independence or to the social and economic aspirations of the majority population. Nevertheless, it brings the outsider status of Protestants into sharp focus and demonstrates just how much of a chasm separated them from mainstream Irish society. And likewise, the well-known cartoon of the newsroom in the Irish Times, published by Dublin Opinion in 1930, emphasises the outsider status which that newspaper retained until the 1960s, a defiantly Protestant institution like the Kildare Street Club. This cartoon is also by C.E. Kelly, and much of its humour derives from the anachronistic atmosphere of the newsroom as portrayed by him. Staff in top hats or mortarboards, a porter with medals from ancient wars, Burke's Peerage and Debrett's on the bookshelves, described as works of deference, and references to Sackville Street and Kingstown. The cartoon's piece de resistance, inverting marginality, is the depiction of the Irishman's diary, corralled off from the rest of the newsroom and occupied by a peasant and his pig. It demonstrates that whereas the Protestant minority may be outsiders in Irish society, the majority population is marginal within the world of the Irish Protestant. Less gentle and less humorous was the cartoon published in the inaugural issue of the Irish Press on the 5th of September 1931. It shows a line of men and a woman in chains en route to the guillotine. And the first two are dubbed Old Order and Social Pretension. Their imagined fate is absurd fantasy, but there is a serious message. Protestants and others who do not subscribe to Fianna Fáil's version of Irishness will be in trouble when Fianna Fáil comes to power. The caption on the cartoon, slightly misquoting the song of the Lord High Executioner in the Mikado, reads, "We've got them on the list, and they'll none of them be missed." All the cartoons that I have mentioned are reproduced in all their glory in the book Protestant and Irish, soon to be available in paperback. In fairness, however, Irish newspapers and magazines post-independence did not concern themselves much with Protestants. And I found relatively few cartoons targeting Southern Irish Protestant society, institutions, or individuals after 1921. While those that did, as we have discussed, while those that did highlighted the outsider status of Protestants, perhaps the most significant thing about the cartoons is in fact their paucity. This indicates that despite the many advantages Protestants continued to enjoy, they were largely invisible in Irish society post-independence. That was probably by choice. They wished to be ignored. Invisibility was part of their strategy for survival, a point made repeatedly in this book. Caleb Richardson, another contributor to the book, has commented elsewhere on how little Protestants mattered in independent Ireland. And my chapter confirms precisely that. Thank you.
Good evening, and it's lovely to see such a big crowd here. I suppose as a Wexford person, I'm particularly pleased to bring this book here. My father was on the Decade of Centenaries, the Bicentenary, not Decade of Centenaries, but the Bicentenary Committee for 1798, and I think that operated for about 10 years. And he used to say very proudly, if we'd put as much work into the rebellion, we might have won. And that tells you a lot about his attitude to the rebellion. He very, very much on the side of the rebels, which would surprise some people. And it also tells, I suppose, it's a tribute to how integrated we are in this community. And we could be, after 1798, rather a more sectarian community, as in the north, but we're not. And that plays, it's a really good thing to be able to say about Wexford, that somehow we got through 1798 and we live in a very cordial and peaceful atmosphere here. The main reason Ian and I came to pull this book together was because we both found out that there was a lot of myth and misunderstandings about Protestant in the New Ireland, both in some sectors of the general community here in the Republic and amongst some Protestants in Northern Ireland also. All Protestants in the Republic tend to get conflated by somebody or other with being gentry or landlord class or longing to be united with Britain again. And this is far from the case for most of the Protestant population. And Northern Protestants sometimes have the idea that Protestants had a hard time in what they call the South and were particularly badly treated in Wexford in 1798, in the War of Independence, Civil War, and generally. Stories of the barn burning at Scullabogue, so close to here, are really well known in the north, often far more close to the Northern Protestant consciousness than they are to the Wexford Protestant consciousness. I worked for 2 years in Queen's University in Belfast, and once I started a conversation with the bin man on our road and mentioned, he said, "Where are you from?" because he heard the southern accent and they just love the southern accent. And I thought in the beginning I'd have to kind of mimic a northern accent when I was up there to fit in. And instead I realised I could go very flat altogether, and it worked much better. They would start a conversation and say, "Oh dear, you're from very far south, aren't you?" So I'd put on my best purple shirt. So I got talking to this bin man and I mentioned I was from Wexford. "Wexford," he responded. "Wexford. Many of our people were very badly treated in Wexford." To which my gentle response was, "I'm probably what you refer to you as your people. And if it had been as bad as all that, we might have been sharp enough to leave." So we got into a great conversation then about puncturing myths and explaining, my own family position. So part of what this book aims to do is to give information to puncture or amend those myths that happen when we don't straighten the record. And Protestants have tended to have this knack of keeping quiet, of not raising the head to keep fit into their society. My own family background is in 400 years of Protestant existence here in Wexford. Deirdre mentioned the C word, and I think there's probably a lot of C in my background. But we try not to talk about that. We've just fudged the 400 years or so. My father's family on his mother's side were Elmses from a place called Robinstown, very near to Old Ross. And my mother's family were deacons from the Lep, nearer to Enniscorthy. So much of our existence has been peaceful and productive engagement in the local community, the vast majority of it. The Elmses lived not too far from Scullabogue, and also not too far from Carrickburn Hill, the rebel camp in 1798. We have a great collection of letters, which are online, and I think are probably here in the library as well. And they describe their existence, and they're very descriptive of the 1798 rebellion locally. And while the Elms family crops were ruined and their animals slaughtered, none of the family, or any of the other, 17 families in Old Ross Church, were harmed. And indeed, one of my several times great-grandfathers used to brag that as a 3-year-old during the rebellion, he was brought into safety in a milk churn from Robinstown to Old Ross, and that he never broke a bone in his life because he drunk the contents of the milk churn by the time he got there. What's never said in that family story is that he had to be protected and brought in there by Catholics, or at least a family friendly with the rebels. During the War of Independence Civil War period, my grandfather, Harry Milne from Ferns, was a young man who had a grave dug for him twice on the orders of the not-so-local IRA. I think, but I can't confirm, that his crime was selling straw to the British Army. Each time, the Catholic neighbours stepped in to save him, arguing that he was a GA player and a good neighbour. Later in the Civil War, his car was taken by the IRA and Mission, and he was trusted to drive it on condition of silence, and he never ever told us what he did. I'm still trying to find out, but eventually I might. In the 1920s, when our farm near Bric was in severe financial trouble, neighbours helped to save the crops and to sort us out. An act of friendship that typifies Catholic-Protestant relations in Wexford, at least in recent history. Politically, my wider family circles are probably apolitical or more local in focus. I don't get any sense from reading family letters, even during the rebellion, that they had any loyalty to the Crown. And that's quite normal when you think about it for a Cromwellian settlement. My great-grandfather was on the Enniscorthy Board of Guardians in the 1910s, and his wife's cousin, Willie Thorpe, was on the Ross Guardians here then too. My sense that they were very happy to be part of the coming new Ireland was somewhat confirmed when I found a quote of the People in 1914 from Willie Thorpe. Wexford was awash with people joining up with the volunteers, small towns like Kilteely having hundreds queued to sign up. Erskine Barton, a Unionist magistrate in New Ross, I think it was actually Arthurstown, with connections to the Orange Order in Belfast, and yes, he was the brother of Robert, was reported as telling a South Dublin Orange Lodge meeting that Protestants in Wexford were afraid to declare their unionism in the lead-up to Home Rule. He was stirring, he had very little evidence for it. and had been chaired at an Orange Lodge meeting in Belfast for similar claims in 1912 when they chaired him, saying he's a jolly good fellow, and said, if Wexford needs us again, Ulster will not be found wanting. Willie Thorpe disassociated himself from Barton's claim at a meeting of the New Ross Board of Guardians, saying that it was insulting for Wexford Protestants to have their nationalism denied to them. My chapter in the book looks at Protestant engagement with the GA, which I've tried to tease out through oral history interviews, first with family, mostly my mother and my uncle, and then spreading wider. I was really interested in this, as some sports historians claim that Protestants didn't engage with the GA as it was too Catholic and too nationalist. From my family background, with a hurling pitch on the farm near Bunclody, pride in our nation and respect for our neighbour's religion, this was a flawed interpretation. But gradually I came to realise that actually there was little written evidence to prove otherwise. So I set about collecting material for this chapter, and it's quite a mythbuster, showing a very quiet engagement with the GA as a way of engaging with the community in a way that people can't through church. We live in a time of great change, where there are a lot of balls in the air, and no one can predict how or where they will land. There's Brexit, and the daily heat it throws off. I was threatening to lie down like Jacob Rees-Mogg, but I didn't have the glasses or the attitude, which we didn't really expect that great coincidence for our book, but the two really tie in well together, and we think the sales, the really encouraging sales are a lot to do that. Then there's the fact that in the near future, the Catholic nationalist community in the north may have a majority share of the possible votes, and who knows what will happen then. I think Paul Nolan's research has suggested that Catholics will have the majority by the 2021 census. In the past, Protestants have tended to keep their head down to avoid contentious issues and discussions, so that they can blend in peacefully. But it seemed to Ian and I that it was time to raise our personal heads up as Protestants, with a conversation showing how Protestants broadly fit in well here, accepted as a normal part of society, despite the ill-informed myths that very few, but some people still do hold. And I'd just like to confirm that we don't really know the religious composition of all of the 17 authors. I know 4 or 5 of them, but they're definitely a mixture of Catholic, Protestant and atheist. We felt that this book could serve a societally useful purpose by encouraging the development of important conversations about the Protestant position in Irish society, whether in 1922 or now. That puncturing myths, understanding each other better, can help us all to live in a better and more tolerant and less fearful way. We're not the only ones trying to promote this sort of engagement. For example, Quincy Dugan is trying to raise awareness of the history of the Orange Order in the South, which is very much another hidden history. And he's talking about the Orange Order in Wexford and Gorey and places like that. It's not a process that should be rushed, these conversations, but it is a process that will enable all of us to explore what form a united Ireland might take if it were ever to be even seriously imaginable. For this process, nationalists who want an entirely green Ireland and others who want to keep the Union both have to be prepared to change their preconceptions about the form of such an Ireland, enabling a more pluralist society, a place for all of us. There are plenty of signs that people are warming to such a conversation, and I would respectfully suggest that maybe we all might consider how we might adapt and be more curious about each other in a very friendly and perhaps even humorous way for the better of all our society. Thank you.
Each of our 4 speakers for 4 very interesting and diverse but somewhat similar lectures. I mean, and one of the things I think that struck me about it was how complex the history of being Protestant and Irish is. You know, it can't be just told in one version, so to speak, that there is elite, non-elite, there is a rural, urban, you know, there's Presbyterian, Anglican, there is the Dean Griffin encounter with Hubert Butler. There are different versions. So this is my way of saying that Protestantism, at least is the way we're interpreting it here, is a Catholic subject. It incorporates everything. And this is my way of saying that any question that you have of our panel,
is relevant, because it is such a wide variety, it touches such a wide variety of subjects, such a wide variety of interpretations, that any question you might have will be relevant. So because we only have about 5 or 10 minutes, rather than me droning on or perhaps asking our speakers to speak at this, let me just throw it to you if any of you have any questions you want to put to the panel. If you don't, I have a few myself, but I'd prefer to let it go with you. Yes, would you mind just waiting for the...
I suppose the last speaker, from my point of view, is the most interesting. It's a farmer from Bagnallstown, where Bagnall Harvey was a landlord who was executed in 1798. I just want to make a point that I was very involved in the Irish Farmers Association over a period of 20 or 30 years. And the one thing that struck me was how active the Protestant community were in IFA, and the fact that there was never any division. I remember the time Alan Gillis was elected president, I didn't even realise he was a Protestant until I went to a funeral of part of his family. So I think that was a wonderfully positive thing on the farming side. And I just commend her on her speech. It was brilliant.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Sorry, madam here. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for that. Hi, thanks for all the speeches there, and the talks were very informative. Few thoughts. Growing up in the early 1980s, I can remember a neighbour's funeral in North County Wexford. He was Church of Ireland, just over 25 years since feathered, and I can remember 2 other neighbours saying to each other, I think it'll be okay to go to the funeral if we stand outside the church. And these were all neighbours in the, context of what the previous gentleman spoke about there, saying that it's the ordinary everyday things that get over differences at times, whether it be farming communities, business, workplace, community sports, whatever else. And we had, I think was it Jack Booth was the president in the GA in the 1990s as well. Same church 15 years later, joined carol services. Nonetheless, that wasn't surprising, given that it was less than 50 years since, I think it was the entire cabinet stood outside the church for Douglas Hyde's funeral in Christchurch, I think. I wonder, are parts of the Protestant community experiences south of the border somewhat similar, maybe a little bit to the Catholic experiences north of the border in 1921? That's my only query about that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. It's very interesting. I think we should always bear in mind that things like the Feathered-on-Sea controversy and the Tilson case and 1 or 2 others, the thing is about them is their exceptionability. There weren't very many of these things, and it's quite easy to extrapolate from these very relatively rare events into a whole notion of the Southern Protestant community being, as it were, under siege or whatever. And I'm not sure that was the lived experience for 99.9% of Protestants. There were also dark forces, for instance in the Tilson case, who had agendas and who adopted these unfortunate people as symbols of their own political or religious viewpoints. And I think we've got to bear that in mind. We're back to what Maurice was saying about the complexity of the experience. And those things should be seen in the light of how very few there actually were. The Northern Catholic experience, particularly in the 1920 to 22 to 23 period, was much more violent than the experience of Southern Protestants in the same period. There's no question about that. Southern Protestants did not suffer pogroms, as generally defined. Northern Catholics, particularly in Belfast, did.
Just in relation to what the first speaker said there, thank you very much. But we also have 2 chapters on farm politics, 2 or 3 in the book, which you might find indeed very interesting. And in relation to what you said, we had Catherine O'Connor, who's actually also from Marshallstown, a Wexford woman. She's done interviews with the women of the diocese, Church of Ireland women of the Diocese of Ferns, and she looks at feathered and sees that all is not as it seems, like it looks black and white, but in fact there was a lot of community interaction at the time. And I find that whole standing outside the door of the churches, the important thing is they went. You know, that there is that. You can see a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of thing here going on all the time. And it depends on the way you look at the material, I suppose, in a way. And my own studies, my PhD studies around the 1918 flu, and a neighbour of mine in Wexford told me that my grandfather went into the Catholic Church in Ferns when her grandfather died from the flu, and she was just kind of thought that that was very much appreciated as well. You know, so there are all sorts of, I just think we were a fantastic community, you know, given what we might have turned into if things had been managed otherwise.
Could I just make a
I
point?
don't mean the Protestants, I mean Protestants and Catholics.
Could I just make a point in the contrast between the minority south of the border and the minority north of the border after 1922? I think that there is a very significant difference which we don't emphasise down here too often, and that is that the Protestant minority in the south did not withhold allegiance from the state. The Protestant, the Catholics in the north did, and continued to do so, didn't enter Stormont until the 1960s. And even then, only for a very short period, did they consent to the political dispensation in the north. And that is a significantly different background to the treatment of the minority in the south.
Yes, sir.
Cormac gave a wonderfully informative talk. And just as a northerner myself, long since, could I suggest that this group of people go on tour the north and bring their book with them? Because I think a lot of us from that part of the world could benefit from hearing the stories that we have heard this evening. Just over the past couple of days in Rosslare, we've had the opportunity to listen to the Reverend Ruth Patterson. I'm sure that name rings a bell with many people here. And her thing was, we must go out, we must take the risk, we must break bread and see where that leads us. And could I just, as an anecdote, say, during the height of the Troubles, my cousin's wife died in her early 40s. They lived on a farm out near Aldergrove Airport, and they had a long, what we would call in the north, long loaning to the road. And as customary in the north, the coffin was carried out to the road. The coffin, the cortege, was led by a piper. The piper's name was Willie Bickerstaff, who didn't come from the same tradition as the corpse did. Cormac.
Can I just say that a tour of the north is not a bad idea if you're prepared to pay for our life assurance premium. my anecdote is that, and it's the sort of place that engenders this. My son who lives up there was travelling through a particularly grotty and very derelict and unpleasant part of East Belfast, and he caught sight of a piece of graffiti which said, "No Pope here," and somebody had written underneath, "Lucky Pope."
I can take one more question before we... Yes, ma'am.
I've got a loud voice, so I don't need the microphone. Just want to ask you, do you keep your toasters in the cupboard?
My heart said to wipe the table, never mind put the toaster in the cupboard. But I don't keep my jam in the fridge.
And it's a question of whether you pronounce it scone or scone as well. This is what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. You know, these are the things that actually matter.
I'm in exile from me, so I call it scone.
I'm stalling myself.
Okay, look, I'll take one final question. Just, yes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel indeed for their contributions. They didn't cover actually the significant decline in the population of Protestants from independence right throughout the 20th century, which I think might be worth hearing. Second thing I'd like to say, maybe in response to the cartoon in the Irish press, I mean, some short few years later, the first president of Ireland on the nomination of Eamon de Valera was in fact a Protestant. And I recall, in fact, Erskine Childers saying a few decades later when he was elected President of Ireland that the international media at his press conference the following day were astonished that a Protestant could be elected President of the Republic. And it shows that you've got to distinguish, I think, between the myths and the facts. And finally, I'd just like to say with regard to Northern Ireland, I have a friend who ran in the Assembly elections on the last occasion. In fact, he went on to be elected and became a minister in the Stormont government. But he told me that in his campaigning in Lisburn, he came to a house and this lady came to the door and told him that she was a Catholic who had moved from West Belfast. And she said, there are 8 votes in this house and they're all going to you. He was a DUP member and they're all going to you. And it was on the basis of the strong support of the DUP for human life in all its stages. So it was quite interesting. So there may be the start of a shift, in the sectarian divide.
Well, I think that's a very cautionary tale about being wary about making generalizations about anybody, whether we're Protestant or Catholic. At this point, can I just thank all of our speakers for 4 very interesting presentations. Can I thank you for engaging with them so well? And can I ask Brian just to say a few words about the next item on the programme?